The Alpha King publicly rejected his Omega, until he discovered she was carrying the royal family's secret. What could possibly make an Alpha King regret such a public decision? And what kind of secret could be so important that it changes everything after the rejection? If stories filled with destiny, betrayal, and unforgettable twists are your favorite, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, if you witnessed a public rejection like this, would you ever believe the whole truth was still hidden? Now, let the story unfold where one moment changes everything and nothing is quite as it first appears. The moment you cast away someone who truly belongs to your destiny, fate begins counting the cost. The silver bells of Mooncrest Citadel echoed across the valley as hundreds of wolves gathered beneath banners stitched with the royal crest, every eye fixed on the grand stone platform where history was about to unfold. The annual Moon Bond ceremony had always been a celebration of loyalty, honor, and the sacred promise between an alpha and the one chosen to stand beside him. This year was different. A restless silence drifted through the crowd, carried by a cold autumn breeze that swept across the towering pines surrounding the palace. At the center of the platform stood Alpha King Cale Ashford, his broad shoulders wrapped in a midnight cloak trimmed with silver, his expression calm enough to hide every thought behind eyes as cold as winter skies. Beside him stood Evelyn Carter, the quiet Omega who had spent years serving the royal household without complaint. Her pale ivory dress fluttered softly in the wind, simple compared to the elegant gowns worn by the noble daughters watching from the front rows. She kept her chin high despite the whispers moving through the gathering like invisible waves. Everyone knew the rumors. They had repeated them for weeks. An Omega from an ordinary bloodline could never become Luna of the most powerful kingdom in the north. Some insisted Cale had only tolerated her presence out of duty. Others believed the moon goddess herself had made a mistake. Evelyn heard every word, yet she remained silent, her fingers tightening around the small silver pendant resting against her heart. It had belonged to her mother, the only piece of family she had left, and somehow it gave her enough strength to remain standing beneath the weight of hundreds of judging eyes. Then Cale stepped forward. His voice rolled across the courtyard with the confidence of a king accustomed to absolute obedience. Before the kingdom and beneath the light of the moon goddess, I reject Evelyn Carter as my future Luna. The words settled over the crowd before erupting into stunned murmurs. A few nobles exchanged satisfied smiles while others lowered their heads, unwilling to witness the heartbreak written across Evelyn's face. For one endless heartbeat, even the wind seemed to disappear. She felt every stare, every silent judgment, every expectation that she would break apart in front of them. Instead, she drew a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and met Cale's gaze without anger. There was sadness in her blue eyes, but there was also quiet dignity that no public rejection could erase. Without pleading, without defending herself, and without speaking a single word, she offered the smallest respectful bow before turning away from the platform. Gasps followed her first step. No one had expected grace. They had expected tears. As Evelyn disappeared through the towering palace gates and into the fading afternoon light, an uneasy feeling settled deep inside the hearts of those who watched her leave. None of them could explain why the celebration suddenly felt hollow, why the royal banners no longer looked as bright, or why the ancient wolves standing among the elders exchanged troubled glances without saying a word. High above the palace, hidden behind drifting clouds, the full moon quietly emerged hours earlier than anyone expected, casting a pale silver glow across the kingdom as though it alone had witnessed something the rest of the world had failed to understand. The road beyond Mooncrest Citadel stretched for miles through golden fields and quiet forests, yet Evelyn Carter never looked back. Every step carried her farther from the palace that had once felt like home and closer to a future she could not yet imagine. The crisp morning air brushed against her cheeks, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain, while fallen leaves crunched beneath her worn boots. She had left with nothing except a small travel bag, a faded cloak, and the silver pendant resting against her heart. The palace guards had offered no farewell. The servants who had once shared kind smiles with her had remained behind silent windows, afraid that even kindness might be mistaken for disloyalty. Only the old stable keeper had quietly slipped a loaf of fresh bread into her hands before sunrise, whispering that the road was always kinder than pride. His words stayed with her long after the towering castle disappeared beyond the hills. 2 weeks later, Evelyn arrived in the peaceful village of Willow Brook, a quiet settlement tucked beside a winding river where no one asked questions unless someone wished to answer them. The villagers welcomed strangers with cautious smiles instead of suspicious stares, and before long she found work helping an elderly baker named Martha Holloway. Every morning before dawn, warm light spilled through the bakery windows as fresh bread filled the air with comforting aromas. Evelyn worked with steady hands and a gentle smile that slowly earned the trust of everyone who walked through the wooden door. Children laughed whenever she offered them an extra roll, and older neighbors often lingered just long enough to thank her for listening to stories that no one else seemed to have time to hear. For the first time in many years, her days were measured by simple routines instead of royal expectations. Yet every night, when silence settled across Willow Brook, she found herself standing beside the river, watching the moon shimmer across the water. Questions she refused to speak aloud drifted through her thoughts like distant echoes. Had Cale ever doubted his decision after she walked away? Had the palace already forgotten her name? She always pushed those thoughts aside before they could take root. The past belonged behind her. The future demanded all of her strength. Then one cool evening, everything changed. While carrying baskets of flour into the bakery, an unexpected wave of dizziness swept over her. She steadied herself against the wooden counter as Martha hurried to her side with worried eyes. After insisting Evelyn rest, the older woman quietly invited the village healer to visit. Hours later, the gentle healer finished her examination and smiled with unexpected warmth. Evelyn stared in stunned silence as the woman softly explained that she was expecting a child. Her heart skipped before settling into a rhythm unlike anything she had ever known. Joy, fear, confusion, and disbelief collided all at once. She rested both hands over her stomach without realizing it, as though instinct alone already knew someone precious was there. That night, she could not sleep. Outside her tiny cottage, the forest remained unusually quiet until a chorus of distant wolves suddenly rose beneath the silver moon. Their haunting calls carried across the hills, not with anger or sorrow, but with quiet reverence. Hidden among the towering trees, several wolves emerged from the darkness and faced the direction of Evelyn's home without crossing the edge of the forest. They remained perfectly still, lowering their heads beneath the moonlight as though honoring a presence they could not fully understand. Inside the cottage, unaware of the silent gathering beyond her window, Evelyn closed her eyes with one hand resting gently over the new life she carried, never imagining that the first whispers of destiny had already begun traveling far beyond the peaceful village where she believed she had finally disappeared. 3 peaceful weeks passed, and Willow Brook slowly became more than a place to hide. It became the first place where Evelyn Carter could breathe without feeling the weight of whispered judgment pressing against her shoulders. Every sunrise began with the comforting rhythm of kneading fresh dough beside Martha Holloway, while every evening ended with a quiet walk along the river where golden light faded into silver beneath the rising moon. The gentle life should have eased her heart, yet something inside her was changing in ways no ordinary pregnancy could explain. It began with dreams. Night after night, she found herself standing inside an ancient hall she had never seen before. Marble pillars reached toward a ceiling filled with glowing constellations, and a cradle carved from white oak rested beneath a crown that floated without support. Before she could step closer, a warm voice always whispered the same words: "Protect what was entrusted." Then she would awaken with her hand resting over her stomach and tears she could not explain shimmering in her eyes. The strange dreams were not the only mystery. Birds gathered outside her cottage every morning without fear. Injured animals that normally fled from humans wandered close enough for her gentle touch to calm them before quietly returning to the forest. Even the old shepherd in the village remarked that his restless sheep had become unusually peaceful whenever Evelyn passed by. She smiled politely, believing it was only coincidence, but Martha noticed the growing uneasiness behind her quiet eyes. One afternoon, Martha invited someone she trusted more than anyone else in the valley. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, an elderly healer whose wisdom had guided generations through illness, birth, and loss. Her silver hair framed kind green eyes that seemed capable of seeing far beyond ordinary appearances. Eleanor asked Evelyn for permission to examine the silver pendant she always wore. The moment her weathered fingers touched the old necklace, her expression changed. The warmth in her face faded into stunned silence as faint silver patterns briefly shimmered across the surface of the pendant before disappearing again. Eleanor slowly looked toward Evelyn's stomach, then closed her eyes as though listening to something no one else could hear. The room remained completely still until she finally whispered, "This is not ordinary." Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. She searched the healer's face for reassurance, but found only quiet concern mixed with profound wonder. Eleanor carefully explained that certain royal bloodlines carried ancient blessings that rarely revealed themselves for generations. They were not measured by wealth or power, but by signs that nature itself recognized. She gently described the unusual calm among the animals, the recurring dreams, and the strange harmony surrounding Evelyn as pieces of a pattern preserved in forgotten stories older than the kingdom itself. Evelyn tried to shake her head. She insisted there had to be another explanation. She was only an Omega who had left the palace with nothing except memories she wished to forget. Eleanor reached across the table and softly covered Evelyn's trembling hands. "Sometimes," she said, "the greatest truths choose the quietest hearts." She then offered one final warning. No matter what happened, no matter who came searching, Evelyn must tell no one about the child until the right moment revealed itself. Some secrets protected kingdoms. Others protected lives. As dusk settled over Willow Brook, Evelyn stepped outside carrying more questions than answers. Above the quiet rooftops, the full moon glowed brighter than she had ever remembered, and for just an instant, she thought she saw a faint silver crown reflected across the river before the ripples carried the image away into the darkness. Far beyond the peaceful streets of Willow Brook, Mooncrest Citadel no longer felt like the unshakable heart of the kingdom. A quiet uneasiness had settled over the ancient palace, spreading from its towering halls to every corner of the royal grounds. Servants spoke in hushed voices. Royal guards exchanged uncertain glances during every changing watch. Even the oldest wolves admitted they had never witnessed the palace itself behave so strangely. It began with the Hall of Kings, where generations of alpha rulers had been honored beneath towering stone statues carved centuries before. At sunrise, the crystal crest above the royal throne, a sacred relic said to reflect the strength of the royal bloodline, no longer glowed with its familiar silver light. Instead, it pulsed faintly before fading into an unusual stillness that no scholar could explain. For the first time in living memory, the throne room felt empty despite being filled with advisors, nobles, and warriors. Alpha King Cale Ashford stood silently before the ancient relic, his reflection barely visible across its polished surface. Since the ceremony weeks earlier, he had buried himself in endless council meetings, border reports, and trade negotiations, convincing himself that duty left no room for regret. Yet every time the palace corridors fell quiet at night, his thoughts drifted toward the woman who had walked away without begging him to change his mind. He told himself he had protected the kingdom by making the difficult choice expected of a ruler. Even so, the memory refused to fade. Elder Nathaniel Blackwood, the oldest royal historian, slowly entered the chamber carrying a weathered book wrapped in faded blue cloth. Few people had ever seen the enormous volume, and even fewer knew it existed. He carefully placed it upon the council table before opening pages that had not been touched for decades. Dust floated through the sunlight as elegant handwriting filled with ancient symbols covered each page. The old scholar pointed toward an illustration showing a silver crown surrounded by a full moon. Beneath it, one sentence had been written in careful script. When the light of the throne grows silent, seek the forgotten blood before the kingdom loses its guiding star. A heavy silence settled across the room. Several advisors dismissed the passage as little more than an old legend, but Nathaniel slowly shook his head. He explained that every time the royal crest had dimmed throughout recorded history, a hidden branch of the royal bloodline had eventually emerged, restoring balance before disaster could reach the kingdom. No one knew where that bloodline came from or how it remained hidden. The records simply called it the protected line. Cale folded his arms, trying to remain focused on reason instead of superstition. Yet before he could speak, another unexpected event interrupted the meeting. The ceremonial crown resting inside its crystal case released a soft silver glow that illuminated the chamber for only a heartbeat before fading once again. Every elder present instinctively lowered their heads. None of them remembered the crown reacting without being touched. Nathaniel quietly closed the ancient book and met Cale's eyes with unmistakable concern. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "the kingdom is not searching for power. It is searching for someone." Those words lingered in Cale's thoughts long after the council ended. As evening settled over Mooncrest Citadel, he stepped onto the highest balcony, overlooking the endless forests stretching toward the distant valleys. Somewhere beyond those trees, unseen by the kingdom that had forgotten her, destiny continued moving one quiet step at a time while the ancient heart of the royal family waited for someone it had recognized long before anyone else ever would. The next morning, a royal messenger arrived breathless at the council chamber carrying reports gathered from villages scattered across the northern territories. None of them mentioned war, famine, or rebellion. Instead, every report described the same impossible pattern. Shepherds claimed that wild wolves had begun gathering peacefully beneath the full moon without challenging one another. Hunters spoke of ancient forest paths glowing faintly before sunrise. Travelers insisted they had heard haunting howls that sounded less like warnings and more like songs welcoming someone home. Individually, each story seemed harmless. Together, they formed a mystery no one could dismiss. Elder Nathaniel quietly spread the reports across the council table before tracing a weathered finger over a faded map. Every unusual event pointed toward one place: Willowbrook. The peaceful farming village had never appeared in royal records for anything important. It stood miles away from trade routes and military roads, hidden beside a gentle river where life rarely changed. Yet every strange sign seemed to flow toward that quiet valley. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. They agreed that someone needed to investigate without alarming the surrounding villages. Rumors alone could create panic, especially when ancient legends were involved. Cale listened without interrupting, though a strange feeling settled deep within him the moment Willowbrook was mentioned. He could not explain why the unfamiliar name stirred a quiet restlessness inside his chest. It was as though some invisible thread had tightened between him and a destination he had never visited. Rather than leading an armed escort himself, Cale ordered Captain Lucas Bennett, one of the kingdom's most trusted commanders, to travel discreetly with only a handful of loyal companions. Their instructions were simple: observe, ask questions, disturb no one. Above all, discover why the ancient signs seemed to gather around an ordinary village. 2 days later, Lucas and his companions entered Willowbrook dressed as merchants rather than royal guards. They found nothing that resembled danger. Children chased one another through the streets. Farmers laughed while repairing old fences. Fresh bread drifted from the village bakery, filling the cool afternoon air with comforting warmth. Everything appeared wonderfully ordinary. Yet as Lucas spoke with the townspeople, one name surfaced again and again: Evelyn Carter. The villagers described her as kind, hardworking, and unusually gentle. They admired how she remembered everyone's name, helped neighbors without expecting anything in return, and somehow calmed frightened animals with only her presence. Martha Holloway proudly spoke of the young woman who had transformed her bakery with quiet dedication, while several children insisted that birds followed Evelyn wherever she walked. Lucas smiled politely, dismissing the stories as small-town affection until something unexpected happened. As Evelyn stepped outside carrying a basket of warm bread for an elderly neighbor, every conversation in the nearby square seemed to soften without anyone realizing it. A nervous horse that had been refusing to move suddenly relaxed as she passed. A flock of sparrows landed along the fence beside her without fear before lifting gracefully back into the sky. Lucas watched carefully, unable to explain why the simple moment felt strangely significant. Hidden beneath her cloak, Evelyn rested one hand over her growing child almost without thinking. She did not notice the travelers observing her from across the square, nor did she recognize the thoughtful expression on Lucas's face as he quietly reached into his satchel and unfolded a faded sketch preserved among the royal archives. Although the portrait had been drawn generations earlier, the resemblance between the woman in the ancient illustration and the silver pendant resting around Evelyn's neck was unmistakable. Lucas slowly folded the parchment again, his heartbeat steady but his thoughts racing. He had arrived expecting to investigate forgotten legends. Instead, he found himself wondering whether destiny had been quietly waiting in the most ordinary place imaginable. Captain Lucas Bennet returned to Mooncrest Citadel before sunrise, carrying no treasure, no captured enemy, and no proof that could satisfy every skeptic gathered inside the royal council chamber. Yet the quiet certainty in his voice silenced the room far more effectively than any dramatic speech. He carefully placed the faded royal sketch beside a detailed drawing he had made of the silver pendant hanging around Evelyn Carter's neck. Every carved line matched perfectly, from the crescent moon at the center to the tiny stars circling its edge. Elder Nathaniel leaned closer, his weathered hands trembling as he compared the two images. After several long moments, he slowly closed his eyes and whispered that the pendant had disappeared with the last recorded member of the protected line nearly 2 centuries earlier. No one had believed it still existed. The chamber remained silent until Cale finally spoke. His voice was calm, but something beneath that calm had begun to crack. He asked Lucas to describe everything he had seen, every conversation, every unusual detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Lucas explained how the villagers trusted Evelyn without hesitation, how frightened animals became peaceful around her, and how an unexplainable sense of calm seemed to follow her wherever she walked. He hesitated before mentioning one final observation. Throughout the entire visit, Evelyn had often rested her hand over her stomach without realizing it, the quiet gesture of someone protecting new life. Cale felt his pulse quicken for reasons he refused to acknowledge. The memory of the moon bond ceremony returned with painful clarity. He remembered the strength in Evelyn's eyes when she accepted humiliation without pleading for mercy. He remembered, convincing himself that the kingdom demanded sacrifice. Now, for the first time, doubt whispered louder than certainty. Before anyone could continue, the crystal crest above the throne released another gentle silver glow. Unlike before, the light remained for several heartbeats, filling the chamber with a soft warmth that every elder immediately recognized. Nathaniel slowly opened the ancient record once more and searched through pages that had not been read in generations. Hidden between 2 faded illustrations, he discovered a passage overlooked by countless historians because part of the parchment had been folded together for decades. With careful hands, he flattened the page, revealing words that made every breath in the chamber seem heavier. The record spoke of a child born from the union between the reigning Alpha King and the hidden royal bloodline. Such a child would awaken the full blessing carried by the founding family and restore harmony whenever the kingdom drifted from its true path. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every eye turned toward Cale. The realization settled over him with crushing weight. Evelyn had left the palace only weeks earlier. If the timing described by Lucas and the ancient record were both true, one impossible conclusion stood before him. He had publicly rejected not only the woman destined to stand beside him, but also the mother of a child tied to the oldest secret his family had ever guarded. Cale slowly stepped away from the council table and looked through the towering palace windows toward the distant forests stretching beyond the horizon. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, he no longer felt like the ruler of an unshakable kingdom. He felt like a man who had failed to recognize the greatest gift ever placed within his reach, and somewhere beyond those endless trees, the one person who held the future of the royal family remained completely unaware that the kingdom had finally begun searching for her. Cale Ashford left Mooncrest Citadel before dawn with only Captain Lucas Bennet riding beside him. He ordered the royal banners lowered and instructed the small escort traveling several miles behind them to remain out of sight unless summoned. This was no royal procession. It was a journey he believed he had to make as a man rather than as a king. Every mile carried him farther from the certainty that had once guided every decision and closer to questions he had never imagined asking himself. Along the winding forest roads, Elder Nathaniel's words echoed relentlessly through his thoughts. The kingdom is searching for someone. Cale had spent years believing strength meant never looking back. Now every memory of Evelyn returned with painful clarity. He remembered the quiet way she comforted frightened children during palace festivals. He remembered how injured messenger hawks somehow recovered faster whenever she cared for them. He remembered countless moments he had dismissed as coincidence simply because no one had ever taught him to recognize quiet miracles. Meanwhile, life in Willowbrook continued with peaceful simplicity. Evelyn greeted neighbors with her familiar smile, although she noticed strangers appearing more frequently in the village market. Travelers lingered longer than usual. Questions about her arrival became slightly more common. None of them seemed threatening, yet Eleanor Whitmore sensed the changing atmosphere immediately. One evening, the elderly healer invited Evelyn to her cottage, where dozens of old books filled wooden shelves from floor to ceiling. Eleanor carefully unlocked a small cedar chest that had remained sealed for decades. Inside rested a delicate tapestry woven with silver thread, faded by time, but still beautiful. At its center stood a woman wearing a pendant identical to Evelyn's, while above her floated a crown surrounded by stars and a full moon. Beneath the image, elegant stitching formed a single sentence. "The hidden branch shall bloom again when compassion carries the future of the throne." Evelyn stared silently at the ancient cloth, unable to speak. Eleanor gently explained that the royal family history known throughout the kingdom had never been complete. Long ago, during a time of division, one branch of the founding bloodline had chosen to disappear among ordinary families rather than become part of a struggle for power. They carried no titles, sought no throne, and passed their identity only through a simple pendant entrusted from one generation to the next. Their purpose was never to rule. Their purpose was to preserve hope until the kingdom truly needed it again. Evelyn slowly touched the pendant resting against her heart. Suddenly, countless forgotten memories surfaced. Her mother had once whispered that the necklace must never be sold or abandoned, no matter how difficult life became. She had always believed those words were only a loving mother's sentiment. Now they carried an entirely different meaning. Before either woman could speak again, the silver thread woven into the ancient tapestry shimmered softly beneath the evening light. At that exact moment, miles away inside Mooncrest Citadel, the crystal crest above the royal throne blazed brighter than it had in generations, filling the empty chamber with radiant silver light visible from every palace window. Elder Nathaniel watched in silent amazement as tears gathered in his eyes. There was no longer any doubt. The forgotten bloodline had awakened at last, and the child Evelyn carried was not simply an heir to the Alpha King. The child represented the living bridge between the kingdom's past and its future, a secret so carefully protected that even the royal family itself had nearly forgotten it existed. By the time Cale Ashford and Captain Lucas Bennet reached the outskirts of Willowbrook, the afternoon sun had painted the valley in warm shades of gold. The peaceful village looked untouched by the uncertainty spreading across the kingdom. Children chased one another through the open square, neighbors greeted each other with familiar smiles, and the comforting scent of fresh bread drifted through the crisp air. For a brief moment, Cale remained still beside his horse. He realized that Evelyn had built a life here without titles, without palace walls, and without anyone reminding her of the painful day she had walked away from Mooncrest Citadel. As they entered the village, curious eyes followed the strangers, but no one seemed frightened. Martha Holloway recognized Lucas from his earlier visit and quietly led the two men toward the small cottage beside the river where Evelyn now lived. Every step felt heavier than the one before. Cale had faced rival alphas, negotiated impossible treaties, and carried the weight of an entire kingdom upon his shoulders, yet nothing had prepared him for knocking on a simple wooden door. Before his hand could reach it, the door slowly opened. Evelyn stood there wearing a soft blue dress beneath her familiar gray cloak. Time seemed to pause. She looked healthier than he remembered, her gentle expression calm, her growing child now impossible to hide. For several heartbeats, neither of them spoke. The silence carried memories words could never fully express. Cale searched her eyes, expecting anger, disappointment, or resentment. Instead, he found quiet strength, the same quiet strength that had allowed her to leave the palace with dignity while everyone else expected her to fall apart. His carefully prepared words suddenly disappeared. "Evelyn," he finally whispered, his voice carrying none of the authority that had once commanded entire armies. "I came because I was wrong." She continued looking at him without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only patience shaped by weeks of healing. Cale lowered his head, something few living souls had ever witnessed. "I believed I was protecting the kingdom," he admitted. "Instead, I failed the one person who deserved my trust the most." Martha quietly stepped back inside the bakery across the lane, giving them privacy, while Captain Lucas respectfully remained several yards away. The village itself seemed to grow still, as though even the wind understood the importance of the moment. Evelyn rested one hand over her child before answering. "You did what you believed was right," she said softly. "But believing something is right does not erase what it costs another person." Her words carried no accusation. That made them even harder to hear. Cale slowly looked up, meeting her eyes once more. "Come home," he pleaded. "Not because of ancient records. Not because of forgotten bloodlines. Come home because I finally understand what I lost." Evelyn glanced toward the peaceful river flowing. Behind her cottage, the gentle current reminded her how life continued moving forward no matter how deeply the past tried to pull someone backward. She turned back to Cale with quiet composure. "The palace was my home once," she replied. "This place became my home when I had nowhere else to go." Trust does not return as quickly as regret. Cale felt the truth of those words settle into his heart with undeniable clarity. For the first time in his life, being Alpha King offered no solution. Titles could not repair broken trust. Authority could not undo public humiliation. Standing before the woman he had once believed was simply an Omega, he finally understood that the greatest distance between two people was not measured in miles. It was measured in the moments when one heart stopped believing it was safe with the other. The following morning, the news spread through Willowbrook long before the church bell announced sunrise. The Alpha King had remained in the village instead of returning immediately to Mooncrest Citadel. He spent the early hours helping Martha Holloway carry flour into the bakery, greeting farmers with quiet respect and listening instead of commanding. The people who had once feared the distant ruler now saw something unexpected. They saw a man willing to learn humility. Evelyn watched from the bakery window, without saying much. Trust had not returned overnight, but she noticed that Cale no longer acted like someone expecting forgiveness simply because he had admitted his mistake. He remained because he believed some things could only be repaired through patience. By midday, Elder Nathaniel arrived with several members of the royal council. Unlike every formal gathering held inside the palace, there were no banners, no musicians, and no elaborate ceremony. The elders simply stood beneath the old oak tree beside the river where generations of villagers had gathered for celebrations and farewells alike. Nathaniel carried the ancient record in both hands before opening it one final time. Looking first at Evelyn and then at the people surrounding her, he quietly declared that the forgotten bloodline had never been lost. It had merely been protected until compassion, rather than ambition, brought it back into the light. He explained that the child Evelyn carried represented hope because the founding family had always believed the greatest leaders would be chosen by character before power. A deep silence settled across the crowd. Then, one by one, the elders respectfully bowed their heads toward Evelyn. They did not bow because she carried royal blood. They bowed because she had displayed grace when the kingdom had offered her none. Kale slowly stepped forward, stopping several feet away so she would never feel cornered. In front of villagers, elders, and his own council, he lowered himself onto one knee. No one had instructed him to do so. It came entirely from his own heart. He looked into Evelyn's eyes and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. A crown may command obedience, but it cannot earn trust. I cannot change the day I hurt you. I can only spend every day after it becoming someone worthy of standing beside you. Tears shimmered in more than one pair of eyes throughout the gathered crowd. Evelyn felt the familiar weight of the silver pendant resting against her heart. For the first time since leaving Mooncrest Citadel, she no longer felt defined by rejection. She felt defined by the choices she had made afterward. She gently reached forward and offered Kale her hand, not as a promise that every wound had already healed, but as a quiet invitation to begin again with honesty instead of pride. As their hands met, the pendant released a soft silver glow, and far away inside the palace, the ancient crystal crest shone brighter than it had in generations. The kingdom had not been restored because an Alpha King reclaimed his Omega. It had been restored because an Omega who had every reason to become bitter chose compassion without surrendering her dignity. Months later, when the child was finally welcomed into the world beneath a peaceful full moon, the celebration belonged not only to the royal family, but to every village across the kingdom. Parents told their children that true strength was never measured by titles, wealth, or fear. It was measured by kindness that survived disappointment, courage that endured humiliation, and a heart that refused to stop believing in hope. And from that day forward, whenever anyone asked how the kingdom found its future, the answer was always the same. It began with the woman everyone underestimated, and with the quiet truth that the brightest legacy is carried not by a crown, but by character.